This video in many ways feels like a time capsule, and I'll explain why later. But to begin the painting process, we use Abyssal Blue by Scale 75. If you do have troubles finding Scale 75, there are Vallejo Scale 75 equivalency charts out there, or better yet, look at the colour. It's black plus white with a cool colour added. There's a lot of blue in there, so try and add black and white and blue until you achieve something similar. Learning how to build up custom blends and paints will be so important for your development as a painter. Learn how to do this, you give yourself the fishing rod. You don't have to beg for fish off nobody anymore. But I do appreciate when painting on mass, it is nice to just have that colour to grab up and paint. Because God knows I don't mix up black and white and blue. I just grab Abyssal Blue because it's pre-made already. Okay, so Abyssal Blue covers a pre-shaded Dreadnought. So black and white has been added to a Dreadnought chassis, and we'll talk about light placement on a Dreadnought chassis in the PDF, in the accompanying PDF tutorial that'll be coming at the end of the month. 2 coats to give it a nice, even, consistent finish is just the thing we are looking for. Then we take Eclipse Grey, which is a very light, neutral grey, again from Scale 75. And we add white to it, opaque white. Now, finding colour equivalencies for white through an airbrush is difficult. Lots of people absolutely love the Tamiya white. I personally can't stand it. I can't get along with it whatsoever. For me, it's finicky, it clogs up my airbrush. White ink, I've heard people have a lot of success with that, but I've hit on something that just works every single time. I don't have to worry about it clogging up my airbrush. It's the Medea Com Art Opaque White. It can be a bit pricey in some areas, it can be quite difficult to find. It's worth the effort to find it. It's worth the struggle, it's worth the price. Any price you have to pay, short of remortgaging your house, pay it. It's that good. Okay, this goes on to further build up the lines and highlights of the miniature. Again, we'll talk about light placement in a bit more depth with the accompanying PDF tutorial that will fall at the end of this month. I'm currently speaking from quarantine, March 17th, 2020. This video does feel like a time capsule. I wonder when we look back on this, whether we'll think, wow, the world just went mad, or whether we'll have the ability to look back at all when the bombs start dropping, people are raiding each other's houses for toilet paper. My God, what stories are we going to tell our children about these times? Anyway, so I try and make this place a refuge from any real life issues, but this is such a dominant story. I mean, if you're watching this live, if you're watching this as this goes up, there's a good likelihood you're in isolation right now. In which case, welcome. I hope you enjoy the video tutorial. I hope you are painting a lot of your miniatures. Don't self-isolate. Promise yourself you'll paint, and go on other nefarious websites that take up a lot of your time. No, stay here, get focused, work out a schedule. Stick to the schedule as much as you're able and get through that pile. Thamar Black is added into the airbrush. We are looking at roughly about 1 part paint, 2 parts thinner. So this is a glaze consistency, and this is added into the shadows. Now, so far, the Abyssal Blue is quite a thick layer. We want a good overall coverage, so we're looking at about 2:1 paint to thinner with the initial base coat, and then from then on we're looking 1:1 paint to thinner to build up the transitions and the tones, and then this final layer of black just to reinvigorate those shadows is 2:1. Oh, sorry, mixing my own paint recipe. This is 1 part paint to 2 parts thinner. So for every scoop of paint you pop in into your airbrush, you need to add 2 parts thinner to it. Creates a light glaze consistency. This tutorial, even though it is a Blood Angel specific Dreadnought I'm painting, is the recipe I'll be using for the upcoming Dark Angels tutorials. They are in the works. I can't say when exactly they are coming, but they will be coming, because I'm working on the models right now. Again, with everything that's happening in real life, I can't give definitive schedules, because I don't know where I'll be, or where anyone will be. But it's coming, it's in the works. You will get a Dark Angels tutorial replete with 4K video tutorial series and PDF. It will get the full Little Legend treatment that it deserves, and hopefully the lion to accompany them. So this baseline tutorial, this black tutorial, would be appropriate for any vehicle that you paint, any Dreadnought that you paint, certainly, and any infantry, basic infantry that you paint. If you wanted to push the contrast a little bit further to give an extra sheen to the armor, you could certainly do that by adding extra white into the mixture to peak those highlights. And then right at the very end, just in the, I think it's the first video tutorial posted on this platform, where we highlighted up to near enough purish white, and then we take a turquoise glaze, so that's roughly 1 part paint to 3 part thinner, and glaze it across the entire miniature. You may want to consider using green for that if you are painting Dark Angels, but again, I'm speaking hypotheticals in the future. This is the mechanisms I'll work through developing a new scheme. But for this scheme is perfectly appropriate for any mass bulk infantry, Dreadnoughts. If you want a good looking black in few steps, this is the tutorial for you. Okay, next up we need to add a gloss varnish across the entire miniature. So I've moved over to a different airbrush. This is the Cult of Paint Infinity Harder and Steenbeck. It comes with a slightly bigger needle, so that means there's less of a likelihood of any clogs happening, and if they do happen, well, it's this airbrush I can clean out easily, and if the mechanism fails, I'm not having it fail on my Iwata. But okay, so we're looking at roughly 2 parts gloss varnish to 1 part water. So 2 parts varnish to 1 part water. This is water soluble, and we give the entire miniature 2 coats and we allow it to fully dry. Next up, we move on to the oil paints. Now, we've covered how to apply oil paints in many video tutorials. If you go into the search bar, and there is, unbelievably, there's a search bar for Patreon. I didn't realize this till a few days ago, but it can only be accessed via the website. So you can, if you go through the app, there's no search bar. If you go via a web browser, there's a search bar for all the content. Type in oil, and the whole list, every single tutorial that's been listed using oil paints will come up. Okay, so the first one we're using a pin wash. So this is a mixture of lamp black and then a small amount of cobalt violet to pigment those shadows. And we're looking roughly maybe 3 parts, 1 part paint to 3 parts thinner. It's a very thin paint. And then the next stage, we are adding a stain to the metallic, so this is much thicker consistency. We're looking roughly 1 part paint to 1 part thinner, or 2 parts paint to 1 part thinner. Once this is fully dried, and it takes around a day to dry, so make sure that the oil stages are the last thing you do in an evening. Then when you come back to it the next day or a couple of days, you can remove any excess things that have gone wrong with the oil paints, because you will inevitably get some overspill. Very easy to clean the day after with some clean Sansador oil thinner. After that, we add a matte varnish. So this is the Vallejo polyurethane varnish, matte varnish across the entire miniature. Use a hairdryer to speed up the drying process, and then we move on to the silvers. For this, I don't just like using a middle-of-the-road silver. I like using emerald alchemy. I like using the blue alchemy that they do. I like using colours, because even though it looks very vibrant on the palette, when you apply it to the miniature, it recedes into the background. That blue, it's not, the blue-green, it's not as, it doesn't stick out and smack you across the face as much as you think it would. Even with something in the style of the Horus Heresy, where it's lots of dark sepia tones, realistic, nuanced, battle damage, by adding colours into desaturated colours. So that's what the Horus Heresy does best. That's what the type of modelling is known for. It's a military scale modelling dream, because it uses a lot of desaturated colours, as opposed to Games Workshop's very saturated style. To create desaturated paint jobs, you simply need to add grey into saturated colours. You take a purple, something, I don't know Games Workshop. Okay, let's take Mephiston Red, for example. That's a relatively saturated red, I believe. Now, in order to desaturate that, take a light grey, pop it in, or dark grey. That desaturates the colour. And it produces much more natural looking reds, because when we look at the world around us, it's not the eye-bleedingly saturated colours that Games Workshop painters Games Workshop armies are normally painted in. What you lose in like dramatic impact from a Games Workshop army, you gain in nuance. So that's why I like adding flourishes of colour, even into desaturated, maybe boring elements. I guess you could argue that the metallic elements, they're something that you just need to get through rather than something to explore. But when you start adding colour into your working process, even if it's just a spike interest, you could create so many more interesting points for you to explore. Okay, so in order to add the stippling, I take a piece of sponge, and this sponge is from a piece of battle foam. Don't use the sponge that you use to clean dishes with, and in order to give me more precision in where I apply the chipping, I revert to my stippling brush. And there are details. I go again into the search function. There's details on how to create your own stippling brush. Basically, you take an older brush that you no longer need, that's the ends have splayed out, and you cut it. You cut it down to create a spiky Bart Simpson headed abomination. But they're fantastic for adding detail and texture work. Okay, next up, we take a good brush that we haven't cut up, and we start applying Elven Gold to highlight the metallics. Now, the order of sequence is very important when painting this Dreadnought and painting infantry. So we added all the metallics before we gloss varnish the surface, because I knew that we'd been matte varnishing the surface and it'll dull everything down. Now, if you added your final few touches before that matte varnish, you destroy the metallic element. By painting it after the matte varnish, we have that wonderful metallic sheen, and we don't have to worry about it chipping off because this is a resin miniature. Even if it falls flat on its face, it's not like the old metal miniatures of days gone past, and they chip up easily. Okay, to finish off the black, I'm using a mixture of ice yellow and eclipse grey in various... so when I peak the highlights, more ice yellow comes into the mixture. When I add a more subtle gradient to the shadow, more eclipse grey is added in. Use your eye, use the pre-shading you've built up so far to determine exactly how much, determine the ratio between ice yellow and eclipse grey. For the most part, I'm adding edge highlights to the piece. I'm breaking this up with the occasional chip here and there, but I do want this to be quite a clean paint job. I don't want this piece of armour to look like it's beaten up quite yet. But I will be adding some rather extensive weathering powder later on to ensure that to give it the look that this has come in from the atmosphere. There's kind of, it's done a superhero landing on one knee, and lots of dirt and soot have sprayed up into the atmosphere around it. But for the most part, this is quite a clean paint job. I'm adding edge highlights to define the features of the sculpt and to bring attention to any areas that I want to draw the attention of the eye to. Especially the head, any battle damage that I'll add, and to the shoulder pads. The paint here, the consistency is rather thick, so we're looking at roughly, I don't know, 2 parts paint to 1 part thinner. It does leave a very strong, indelible mark on the underlying surface of the miniature. I'm oscillating between using the tip of the brush to really peak those edge highlights and using the side of the brush to just capture those very hard-edged lines. So you can see I'm using the edge. I can even use a finger when things go wrong. But using the edge of the brush with quite a thick paint with little dilution in the brush itself. There's very little moisture held within the brush. I'm able to ensure that it hits the very edges of the armor plate. I know people don't like edge highlighting, but it really does help define the lines of the miniature. It makes everything pop. You don't have to add it for every single detail on the miniature. For example, the feet. I know that they'll be scored up. I know they'll be marked up with weathering powder. So I won't add any edge highlighting there. It's only to those areas of the armor that I want to bring attention to, that I want to give a semi-sheen to. So wherever light, the zenithal light comes from above, that's where I want to highlight. but on the whole, rely on your eye to determine how much is enough. In determining exactly the end of a... Oh, I'm sorry, I'm teaching Sam tomorrow at 11. Determining exactly how much is enough is a perennial problem for all of us. Time-wise, how working to a timer is important because it gives you focus in your projects. Working to a schedule, working towards an event, it allows you to think about what techniques I can reasonably employ in this time frame to give the result I need. For the eyes, I start by painting the eyes with, I believe it's ice yellow with a pinch of white, so you can use ivory from Vallejo, or you could just use white at this stage, that's perfectly fine. I use Marrow White from Formula P3, but I have been taken with the Scale 75 Artist paints, the white. I really like the white from that set. It dries very quickly, it kind of gets gummy on the wet palette very quickly, but the advantages more than offset the disadvantages. Okay, Turquoise Blue from Scale 75. Again, if you do have troubles finding Turquoise Blue, this is from the Artist range. Don't worry, there's a colour made by Vallejo called Blue Green, which is nearly identical. Right, Ice Yellow is then used to add a smile, so a grin at the bottom of the eye lens, and then 2 dots up the top to finish off the eye lens. Deep Red by Scale 75 is applied into the shadow, and before it dries I'm taking some orange from the Scale 75 Artist range and blending that together. I'm wet blending on the surface of the miniature to give me a transition. I can neaten it up with subsequent glazes. From here, to add a further highlight, I add Golden Skin, which again is a Scale 75 colour. You can use Sunny Skin Tone from Vallejo, which is a very, very similar in tone. 2 dots in the very darkest area of the gem along the base. Okay, now I've applied, now I've attached it to its base. I wasn't sure of the basing scheme of this miniature, that's why I didn't add it before adding the miniature on. Brown leather is applied to the bottom of his boots. Yeah, I guess they're called boots. Bottom of his legs. Not sure what the terminology is, what the correct terminology is. But anyway, Dark European Earth is loaded up onto the surface of his legs. Let's go with that. And interspersed with this, I'll apply Sansador Thinner through the airbrush. So it will melt into the background, it will bind it onto the surface, and it will give the appearance of fresh soot and earth splashed up against the side of the Dreadnought. I want to give the weathering some manner of dynamism, as if he's just crash landed onto the ground, because these are the drop assault Dreadnoughts. So these things can be launched from orbit and crash land on a planet. It sounds crazy saying it out loud. But these things come with jetpacks. They have limited, I guess, flight capability. They can jump really far. How terrifying is that? This space coffin grave jumping at you, probably screaming. But anyway, so more of this is applied, especially to the carapace. You can see the pigment is completely dry as I take my brush and flick it onto the surface, and the weathering powder should bind onto that wet surface. Now this should be enough to secure the weathering powder to the miniature. If you are a little bit cautious, feel free to add some satin varnish into the mixture, or add some satin varnish at the end. The reason why we use satin varnish is that we do not kill the colour nuance of the metallic. You can also buy pigment fixer, which leaves no trace behind. Lastly, we want to add some black spots to the melter charges and around his generator backpack. This is to give the melter charge effect. And I can see a few places here and there that I just want to play around with, and to show off exactly what this airbrush can do. It's a very, very fine airbrush. I black line the base with it. And that is it, apart from Intensity Blue by Scale 75. This is near enough neat through the airbrush. There's no thinner applied to this. And I apply this across the exhaust fans of the jump pack. And that is it. That is the Incendious, however it's pronounced, Blood Angel Drop Dreadnought. It's a black colour scheme. It offers a skeleton framework on how to develop custom colour schemes of your own Dreadnoughts, and gives you an insight in how to paint Dark Angels black. And this is the final result. If you do use this video tutorial on anything whatsoever, please make sure to tag me. I love seeing what you guys come up with based off these tutorials, and I'll share your work as well through various social media, Instagram, Facebook, Twitter. I'll share you around. Thank you very much, guys, for watching this. Hope you're all staying safe and staying sane. I'll catch you soon, hopefully.